Right now, the District of Columbia and 9 states, 10 by summer, allow doctors to prescribe lethal prescription medication to terminally ill patients so that they can die peacefully. But here in Massachusetts, you'll remember voters narrowly defeated a ballot question that would have allowed the same thing in 2012 by a narrow 51 to 49% margin. And since 1995, 10 bills on the issue have gone before state lawmakers here. The latest is known as the End of Life Options Act, which has backing from the advocacy organization Compassion and Choices, including Dr. Roger Kligler, a retired physician from Falmouth with incurable stage 4 prostate cancer, who sued Massachusetts for the right to seek medical aid in dying, which a judge ultimately denied, while granting doctors the freedom to discuss the practice with patients.
I wonder about the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. How does that work into your thinking?
Do no harm. What is harm, and who gets to define harm?
Dr. Kligler is featured in a new PBS documentary that seeks to answer those questions, hosted by longtime NPR person Diane Rehm, who's been an advocate for medical aid in dying since her husband was denied the option in Maryland before he died in 2014. The film is called When My Time Comes, after a book Rehm published last year by the same name, and in it, she says that for her, the issue is all about individual autonomy, as she told a legislative committee in Maryland.
My philosophy in this matter is to respect that singularly personal moment for each of us. If you believe that only God should be the decider, I support you 100%. If you wish to have every single option that medical science can provide, I support you 100%. And if you believe, as I do, that you want the right to end your suffering at a time you choose, I support you 100%.
Diane Rehm and Dr. Roger Kligler join me now. Welcome to both of you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I'm very glad to have you both. If I can start with you, Diane, you and John Rehm were married for more than a half of a century. What specifically in his long battle with Parkinson's caused you to become an advocate for medical aid in dying?
I think his decision to stop eating, drinking, taking any medication, which ultimately ended his life after 10 long days of suffering, really propelled me forward. I believe that he asked for and was denied, because he was in the state of Maryland, medical aid in dying from his doctor, who could not provide it legally. And so John took matters into his own hands. He was so courageous. He was so determined to do exactly that. Pain is not the number one issue that people ask for medical aid in dying. As Dr. Kligler will, I think, support me in this, it's actually number 6. But John had lost what he felt was all dignity in life and had nowhere to go but down.
Doctor, what came first, your diagnosis or your advocacy?
My advocacy. I had watched my mother die of pancreatic cancer. Well, I'm sorry, neither of them came first. I was an advocate for myself when I turned 40. My mother died of pancreatic cancer, and I said that there was no way that I wanted to die that way.
You
I
know,
then,
I'm sorry. Continue.
no,
Yes, please.
yeah, I then went on to develop cancer and subsequently learned about medical aid in dying.
You're in this film. It comes through very clearly that Diane, doctor, is very tolerant of those with opposing points of view. Are you as tolerant of such people, particularly your fellow doctors who are on the other side of this issue, doctor?
I'm tolerant of them. However, I think that they have an obligation to take care of what the patient needs. I feel that the patient's needs are ultimately what we should be taking care of. And if they're not able to take care of the patient's need for medical aid in dying in states where medical aid in dying is allowed, then they have an obligation to help that person get what the person wants.
That was one of the questions
Go ahead, Diane.
that was one of the questions I asked Dr. Kligler when I interviewed him. That notion of a doctor's vow to do no harm. And Dr. Kligler's response was, who is to determine what harm is? Is it the patient or is it in the hands of the doctor? And I strongly believe that so much harm is being done to patients in the name of simply keeping them alive beyond that point where they would like to give up.
You know, doctor, back to you to follow up on something Diane just said. I have to say, I've never quite understood the distinction between a doctor having the power to extend a life by to withdraw extraordinary measures which would otherwise extend a life, and being allowed to provide medical aid in dying. Why is the former permissible and the latter not?
I think part of it is, we're able actually to do more than that, Jim. We're able to give something called palliative sedation,
of course,
which is we give someone morphine, sometimes morphine to unconsciousness, and the person will die sooner than they otherwise would have. And that is permissible. It's gone through the courts. It's, possible medical care. And I think it's really a fig leaf, of the differentiation. I think that we should be able to help people to have comfort, and comfort has to be defined by the person who is suffering.
You know, Diane, one of the most effective things I thought you did in this film was when you were testifying in front of that Maryland Legislative Committee, you gave voice to all legislators who appeared to have good faith concerns about this. So I want to ask you about a couple of the issues they raised, which we heard a lot here almost 10 years ago in Massachusetts. The slippery slope to euthanasia, particularly with people with severe disabilities. What do you say to those who have those fears?
I think this slippery slope argument has been used again and again. And yet, in the 20 or more years that the Oregon law, on which most laws in this country are based, there has not been a single case where force has been used, where someone has been pressured into making a decision to die, where euthanasia has been carried out. Euthanasia is what is used in parts of Europe. And if people want that, that's where they can go. What is so important here is that the patient must request from his or her doctor that medical aid in dying be allowed, and that doctor must have a second doctor to corroborate that the patient is within 6 months of death. You mentioned the disabled community. It's so interesting because here in Washington, the person who introduced the bill to the D.C. City Council told me that half of the disabled community was fearful, just as you mentioned, and the other half of that community said, why aren't we included? We have the right to make a choice as well. So I think that slippery slope argument has yet to be corroborated.
I'd like
Diane,
to add a couple of things.
Of course, Doctor.
If I could. First thing is that about 1% of people, which is almost the number who use medical aid in dying, of terminally ill people end their own lives. That disappears in states where medical aid in dying is permissible. And so, if you look at it, people are going to do what people feel that they need to do, and no law is going to prohibit them, but they can't do it, with their family and friends around them. The second is that Disability Rights Oregon monitors the disabled community and has been doing this for almost a quarter of a century in Oregon, and they have no cases where people with disabilities have been targeted.
There's one other argument. There was not, if I may, Diane, I want to get this in because we're a little short on time, that frankly was the most persuasive argument against that I heard. It was not from a legislator. It was from Pastor Lamar at D.C.'s Metropolitan AME Church. And it rings particularly true what I'm about to play, because in the time of COVID, we hopefully have become sensitized to the health inequities that people of color, poor people have had to live with forever. Here is Pastor Lamar.
I understand the law. I support what the law makes available, but I do not trust the government and establishment to be fair. If I had a magic wand that would ensure that no person at all, no matter who they are, would be discriminated against, and that they would be treated fairly and honorably, and if this was that person's decision, then I would support it.
Diane, I don't have much time, but what do you say to Pastor Lamar? I mean, he is right about all the inequities in the system and the third and fourth class treatment that people of color get in the healthcare system.
And when you think about experiments like that conducted, the Tuskegee experiment on the issue of syphilis, he has good reason to be distrustful. But if there had been one case where this kind of discrimination had occurred for people of color, since the laws in now 10 states and D.C. have put into place, then I would agree with him. But he himself said, when you can ensure that no discrimination or force takes place, I will support this.
The other part of that is that each individual has to decide for themselves. And so if someone feels that there's discrimination and they want to continue with full care, they can continue with full care.
Diane, I only have 30 seconds left. Massachusetts, as I mentioned, there are bills pending in the era of COVID where people are much closer to death, talking about it much more than they have in the past. The line you use in the film, each of us is one death away from having this position. Are you more optimistic that there'll be a different outcome in Massachusetts this time around?
I testified in Massachusetts 2 years ago I am more optimistic now because there are more supporters for the bill this time than have been in the past. I do not believe a lawmaker should decide whether or not a suffering end-of-life person can die or not.
Dr. Kligler, Diane Rehm, thank you much for your work and advocacy, and thank you for your time tonight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you
Thank
so
you very
much.
much.
The most recent Globe-Suffolk poll from 2019 finds a vast majority of people in the state, 70%, support medical aid in dying. You can watch When My Time Comes online now at the address on your screen.